My name is Madeline, 33 years old, and I just drove 5 hours through freezing November rain only to be handed a stained catering apron the second I stepped through my childhood front door. My mother shoved a heavy stack of porcelain plates against my chest, her eyes glaring with undisguised contempt. She warned me not to breathe a word and ruin the night for my brother. He was about to pitch $1 million merger to his new girlfriend, a high-powered venture capitalist from New York. They expected me to play the silent, invisible servant for the evening. But when his elegant, brilliant guest finally walked through the doorway, she did not look at my brother with loving eyes. She looked straight at the servant holding the plates, and she froze in absolute shock. What my family did not know was that I was the senior forensic accountant her firm had just hired to audit his fraudulent company. Before I continue this story, let me know where you are watching from in the comments below. Hit like and subscribe if you have ever had to stand your ground against toxic relatives who completely underestimated your power. Growing up in our affluent Connecticut suburb, the rules of our household were unspoken, but entirely clear. My older brother Spencer was the undisputed golden child destined for greatness, while I was simply the administrative afterthought. I pulled my car into the driveway of the sprawling colonial house, my tires crunching on the pristine gravel. I had barely turned the lock on the heavy oak front door when Beatrice, my mother, descended upon me. She did not offer a warm hug. She did not ask about my grueling drive from the city. Instead, she practically threw a crumpled white apron at my face. "Put this on right now." Beatrice snapped, her voice carrying that familiar grating tone of absolute authority. "And take these to the kitchen. The caterers are running late, and I will not have Spencer looking like a fool in front of his new partner." I stood in the foyer, the cold wind from the open door still swirling around my ankles. I looked down at the stained apron, then back up at my mother. "I am not the hired help, Mother. I am an invited guest." Beatrice let out a harsh, mocking laugh that echoed off the vaulted ceiling. "A guest? Please, Madeline, you crunch numbers in a cubicle for a living. Spencer is about to secure a massive funding round that will set this family up for generations. His new girlfriend Jasmine runs one of the biggest venture capital funds on the East Coast. She is the epitome of corporate excellence, a managing partner who expects absolute perfection. You are just going to stand in the corner, clear the dishes, and keep your mouth shut. I will not let your depressing little bookkeeping job embarrass your brother tonight." Before I could respond, Spencer strolled into the hallway, adjusting the cuffs of his overly expensive designer suit. At 35, he still wore the same arrogant smirk he had perfected in high school. He looked me up and down, his eyes lingering on the apron in my hands. "Glad you could make yourself useful for once, Maddie," he sneered, checking his gold watch. "Jasmine is going to be here any minute. She operates in a world you cannot even comprehend. Multi-million-dollar term sheets, corporate takeovers, high-stakes boardroom negotiations. Do not try to make small talk with her. You will just bore her with your tax bracket complaints. Just keep the wine glasses full and stay out of our way." The sheer audacity of their entitlement was breathtaking. My mother had literally drained my college savings account a decade ago to fund Spencer and his first failed business venture, claiming I did not have the intellect for an Ivy League education anyway. Now here they were demanding I serve them dinner so he could secure his next financial lifeline. I felt the familiar sting of their disrespect, but this time I did not argue. I did not cry. I just felt a cold, sharp sense of anticipation settling over my entire body. I calmly took the plates from her hands. I tied the apron around my waist, smoothing down the rough fabric over my tailored designer trousers that cost more than my mother's entire holiday wardrobe. I walked toward the kitchen, my heels clicking sharply against the hardwood floor. I arranged the appetizers with meticulous precision, listening to Spencer pace the living room, frantically rehearsing his fraudulent pitch deck. He was sweating, desperate to impress a woman he thought he could easily manipulate. I picked up a tray of crystal glasses ready for the main event. Then the heavy brass doorbell echoed loudly through the entire house. "Showtime," Spencer whispered quickly, fixing his hair in the hallway mirror. He threw open the front door with a wide, practiced smile, ready to play the successful tech CEO. Jasmine stepped over the threshold, bringing a rush of crisp autumn air with her. She was a vision of absolute corporate power, a 34-year-old African-American woman who commanded boardrooms from Wall Street to Silicon Valley. She wore a tailored charcoal pantsuit that screamed quiet wealth, her posture radiating an effortless dominance. Spencer immediately went into his rehearsed routine, eager to play the charming visionary. "Jasmine, welcome to our home," Spencer beamed, reaching out to take her expensive wool coat. "I am so thrilled you could make it out to the suburbs. My mother has been cooking all day to prepare a feast worthy of our future partnership." Jasmine offered a polite, measured smile. She handed Spencer her coat without looking at him, her sharp eyes scanning the living room. She took in the opulent but outdated decor, the excessive crystal vases, and Beatrice, hovering nervously near the dining table. Then her gaze shifted toward the hallway leading to the kitchen. Her eyes locked onto me. I was standing perfectly still, the rough white catering apron tied tightly around my waist, balancing a heavy silver tray of crystal water glasses. I looked right back at her, maintaining absolute eye contact. I did not flinch. I did not look away. Jasmine stopped dead in her tracks. The polite smile vanished from her face instantly. Her posture stiffened, and a look of profound confusion mixed with sudden sharp realization washed over her features. She did not blink. She just stared at the woman in the apron. Spencer noticed her sudden halt. He followed her line of sight and let out a forced, awkward chuckle, desperately trying to smooth over what he perceived as a high society faux pas. He thought she was judging the poor quality of our household staff. "Oh, please ignore the mess in the hallway," Jasmine Spencer said, stepping quickly into her line of vision to block her view of me. "That is just my younger sister, Madeline. She is a bit socially awkward, so we put her to work. She does some basic bookkeeping for a local firm, nothing you would ever need to concern yourself with. Maddie, hurry up and take those glasses to the kitchen. We have serious business to discuss tonight." Beatrice hurried forward, eager to validate her golden child and enforce my subordinate status. "Yes, Jasmine, do come in and sit down," my mother chimed in, glaring at me over Jasmine's shoulder. "Madeline is just helping out the caterers. She has never had the head for high-level strategy like Spencer does. We are just glad she found a little administrative job to keep her busy. It keeps her out of trouble. Now, can I get you a drink before we talk about Spencer's amazing new tech startup?" Jasmine did not answer my mother. She did not acknowledge Spencer's practiced, charming laugh. The temperature in the room seemed to drop 10 degrees. Slowly, Jasmine turned her head to look at Spencer. The raw intellect and predatory sharpness of a top-tier venture capitalist flared in her eyes. She looked at him not like a prospective romantic partner, but like a deeply flawed financial statement that she was about to thoroughly dismantle. Without uttering a single word to my brother, Jasmine stepped around him. She brushed past my mother completely, leaving Beatrice standing awkwardly with a forced smile frozen on her face. Her high heels clicked against the hardwood floor with deliberate, measured precision as she walked straight toward me. Spencer swallowed hard, his smile faltering completely. "Jasmine, the dining room is this way," he stammered, his voice cracking slightly as panic began to set in. He thought she was going to scold the help. He thought his perfect evening, his meticulously planned million-dollar pitch, was being ruined by my mere presence in the hallway. He reached out to grab her arm, then thought better of it, letting his hand drop uselessly to his side. Jasmine stopped 2 feet in front of me. She looked at the silver tray in my hands. She looked at the stained catering apron tied over my dark tailored trousers. And then she looked me directly in the eyes. The silence in the room was absolute. You could hear the antique grandfather clock ticking heavily in the corner. I gave her a very slight nod, giving her silent permission to blow this entire charade wide open. Jasmine let out a low, humorless exhale. She reached out and placed her hand over mine right on the edge of the silver tray. "Madeline," Jasmine said, her voice rich, powerful, and carrying perfectly across the silent room. She did not sound confused anymore. She sounded dangerously angry on my behalf. "What on earth are you doing wearing a catering apron?" Spencer rushed forward, his face pale, waving his hands frantically. Jasmine. I apologize, she really is just my useless sister. She does not know how to interact with people at our level. Please just ignore her. Jasmine whipped her head around her eyes, pinning Spencer to the spot like a spear. Your level? Jasmine repeated, her voice dripping with pure ice. She turned back to me, perfectly enunciating her next words so they echoed through my family's hollow house. Spencer. The woman holding your water glasses is not a basic bookkeeper. She is the senior partner. The word senior partner hung in the air like a guillotine blade. Spencer physically recoiled, his polished veneer shattering into a million pieces. His mouth opened and closed silently, unable to process the collision of his fabricated reality with the cold, hard truth. The tray of water glasses in my hands suddenly felt as light as a feather. I untied the stained catering apron from my waist, letting it drop to the floor right next to my brother's expensive Italian leather shoes. Jasmine did not break eye contact with Spencer. Her voice was terrifyingly calm, the kind of calm that precedes a massive corporate bloodbath. She crossed her arms over her tailored suit. Spencer, did you honestly think my venture capital firm was going to hand you a $20 million term sheet without running a microscopic background check on your operations? We do not write blank checks based on charming smiles and flashy presentations. When your Q3 financials flagged multiple anomalies, I hired the most ruthless forensic accounting firm in New York to audit your books. Spencer swallowed hard, the color draining entirely from his face. He looked at me, then back at Jasmine, his voice trembling. You hired Madeline, but she just does basic taxes. She is a low-level clerk. She is the senior forensic accountant overseeing your entire audit, Jasmine corrected sharply, her tone leaving absolutely no room for debate. She has been inside your company servers for the past 3 weeks. She knows exactly where every single penny of your venture funding has gone. And frankly, the fact that you do not even know what your own sister does for a living tells me everything I need to know about your attention to detail. That was when Beatrice decided to intervene. My mother could not stand watching her golden child squirm. She marched forward, her face flushed with defensive anger, completely misreading the severity of the situation. She placed a protective hand on Spencer's arm and shot me a look of pure venom. Jasmine. Please, you must be terribly confused, Beatrice said, letting out a condescending laugh. Madeline has always had a highly active imagination. She likes to exaggerate her little administrative jobs to make herself feel important. It is a severe inferiority complex she has had since childhood because Spencer was always the gifted one. She probably lied on her resume to your firm. You cannot possibly trust a word she says about my son's business. She is just trying to sabotage him out of pure bitter jealousy. Jasmine slowly turned her gaze to my mother. The venture capitalist looked at Beatrice as if she were a fascinating, slightly repulsive insect. I watched the power dynamic shift entirely. My mother was used to bullying local neighborhood association members and country club wives. She was completely unequipped to handle a Wall Street apex predator. Mrs. Vance, Jasmine said, her voice dropping an octave. I do not get confused. I personally vetted Madeline's credentials. She holds dual master degrees in finance and criminal accounting. She has taken down 3 corrupt executives this year alone. Your daughter is a lethal weapon in the financial sector. The only person suffering from an active imagination in this room is the man standing next to you. Beatrice gasped, her hand flying to her chest in theatrical offense. She looked at Spencer, expecting him to defend her, to defend himself. But Spencer was paralyzed. The reality of his situation was finally crashing down on him. The sister he had forced to wear an apron and serve water was the exact same person holding the keys to his financial survival. He knew his books were dirty. And he suddenly knew that I knew it too. Spencer ran a shaking hand through his perfectly styled hair. He tried to force a smile, but it looked more like a grimace. Jasmine, let us just calm down. We can sit down, have some wine, and go over the numbers together. I can explain everything. Please let us move to the dining room. I saved the seat at the head of the table right next to me for you. He gestured desperately toward the elegant dining room where the table was set with our finest crystal and silver. He was begging for a reset, hoping his charm could somehow override federal financial laws. Jasmine looked at the dining room table. She looked at the prominent chair Spencer had reserved for her, right by his side, designed to showcase them as a powerful corporate couple. Then she looked at me. "I will not be sitting next to you, Spencer," Jasmine said coldly. She walked past him, grabbed the heavy oak chair designated for the head of the table and dragged it entirely across the room. The loud screech of wood against the hardwood floor made my mother wince. Jasmine slammed the chair down right next to my assigned place setting at the far end of the table, the spot usually reserved for the forgotten family members. Jasmine sat down, smoothed her suit jacket, and looked directly at my terrified brother. "Take a seat, Spencer. Serve the food. I want this dinner to commence immediately." Spencer stood paralyzed for a long moment before his legs finally obeyed him. He slowly walked over to his original seat, now miles away from Jasmine, and collapsed into it like a man walking to his own execution. My mother, utterly desperate to salvage the wreckage of the evening, rushed into the kitchen and returned carrying a massive silver platter holding the roasted turkey. Her hands were shaking so violently that the serving utensils rattled against the metal. The dinner began in a state of suffocating tension. The only sounds in the grand dining room were the scraping of silver forks against fine china and the heavy, ragged breathing coming from my brother. Jasmine sat beside me, her posture impeccably straight, slicing her meat with the surgical precision of a coroner. She did not look at Spencer. She did not compliment the meal. She simply waited, letting the silence crush the air out of the room. Beatrice could not handle the silence. In her mind, any quiet moment was a lost opportunity to sell her golden child. She poured herself a massive glass of Chardonnay, took a generous gulp, and forced a shrill, artificially bright laugh that echoed painfully off the walls of the dining room. "Well, since we are all sitting together, we should talk about the future," Beatrice announced, pointing her wineglass toward Jasmine. "Spencer has always been a visionary. Even when he was a little boy, he was building empires out of blocks while other children were just playing in the dirt. He has a true gift for corporate strategy and resource allocation." I kept my eyes on my plate, cutting a small piece of asparagus. I knew exactly where this pathetic monologue was going. In fact, Beatrice continued, her voice growing louder and more confident as she convinced herself the pitch was working. "I recognized his genius early on. 10 years ago, when he needed seed money for his very first tech startup, I made a difficult but necessary executive decision for the family. I liquidated Madeline's entire college savings account and handed every single penny over to Spencer." Spencer closed his eyes, his face twisting in silent agony. He knew what a colossal mistake his mother was making, but he was too terrified of Jasmine to speak up and stop her from talking. "It was simply the most logical investment," Beatrice said, turning to look directly at Jasmine, fully expecting a nod of corporate approval. Madeline had only been accepted into a public state university. She was never smart enough for an Ivy League education anyway. Her test scores were aggressively average. Putting that money toward a basic accounting degree would have been a terrible return on investment for this family. Spencer needed the capital to disrupt the market. I made the tough choice that any smart venture capitalist would make. I cut the dead weight to fund the absolute winner. Jasmine stopped chewing. She slowly placed her knife down on the edge of her plate. She looked at my mother with an expression of such profound disgust that Beatrice actually took a physical step back from the table. "You stole your daughter's education fund," Jasmine clarified, her voice dangerously quiet. "You stole it to fund a startup that, if I recall correctly, went bankrupt within 8 months because your son spent the capital on leased sports cars and luxury vacations to Miami." Beatrice stammered, her face turning crimson under the dining room chandelier. "Well, it was a learning experience for him. Every great entrepreneur has a failed venture under their belt. It taught him how to handle large sums of money." I let out a soft, genuine laugh. The sound cut through the suffocating tension like a razor blade. I looked at my mother, who was desperately clinging to the illusion of our family's prestige, and then I looked at my brother, who was currently sweating right through his designer collar. They had spent my entire life trying to convince me that I was small, stupid, and unworthy of a seat at the table. They had stolen my future to buy him a shortcut, and now they were bragging about it to the very woman holding the keys to his financial survival. I did not feel angry anymore. Not feel angry. I felt entirely in control. I took a slow sip of my ice water. Then I calmly set down my silver fork. It made a sharp, decisive click against the china plate. I reached for the crisp white linen napkin and carefully wiped the corners of my mouth. I folded the napkin and placed it neatly on the table. I leaned forward and looked directly at my terrified brother. Why did $2.4 million evaporate into a ghost account in the Cayman Islands? The question hung over the dining table, heavy and lethal. Spencer stared at me, his eyes wide and completely hollow. The confident tech CEO facade he wore 10 minutes ago melted away, revealing a panicked little boy caught with his hand in a multi-million-dollar cookie jar. The color drained from his face, only to be violently replaced by an angry dark red flush that crawled up his neck and settled in his cheeks. "What are you talking about?" Spencer stammered, his voice lacking its usual commanding boom. "That is absurd. You do not know how to read corporate tax structures, Madeline." I did not break eye contact. I leaned back in my chair, resting my hands in my lap. "I am a forensic accountant, Spencer. Reading corporate tax structures is literally the only thing I do. And your structure is not complicated. It is actually incredibly sloppy. $2.4 million was wired from your primary operating account on September 14th directly to an entity called Apex Holdings Limited, an entity registered to a post office box in Grand Cayman." Spencer swallowed hard. A bead of sweat dripped down his temple. He glanced desperately at Jasmine, who was watching him with the terrifying stillness of a viper preparing to strike. "That was a strategic offshore research and development allocation." Spencer spat out, his voice rising in volume as he scrambled for tech buzzwords. "It is a standard operational procedure for startups scaling into international markets. Jasmine knows this. Every major tech firm utilizes tax-efficient global jurisdictions. You are twisting standard business practices into some kind of conspiracy because you do not understand high-level finance." He slammed his fist down on the dining table. The heavy mahogany wood shuddered, and the fine crystal wine glasses rattled ominously. "I demand you stop this right now, Madeline. You are entirely out of your depth." I let him have his tantrum. When the crystal stopped rattling, I spoke in a quiet, measured tone that carried easily across the room. "Apex Holdings Limited has no employees, Spencer. It has no physical office. It has no products, no patents, and no operational history. What it does have is a single listed director named Gregory Thorne." "Gregory Thorne is not a software developer," I continued, my voice smooth and relentless. "He is a luxury yacht broker based in Miami. The exact same broker you tagged in a social media post 3 days after the wire transfer went through, standing on the deck of a brand new 70-foot cruiser. You did not allocate funds for offshore research and development. You stole your investors' seed money to buy yourself a floating party boat." The silence that followed was absolute. I had just laid out federal wire fraud in plain English, right over the roasted turkey. Jasmine slowly turned her head to look at Spencer. Her expression was completely unreadable, which made it infinitely more terrifying. "You are lying!" Spencer shouted, his voice cracking with pure desperation. He pointed a shaking finger at me. "She is lying, Jasmine. She fabricated this entire thing. I can show you the real books. She hacked into my system and manipulated the data." Before Jasmine could even open her mouth to respond, Beatrice erupted. My mother could not comprehend the financial terminology, but she understood the tone. She understood that her golden child was being cornered, humiliated, and stripped of his power. And in Beatrice's world, whenever Spencer failed, it was always my fault. She sprang up from her chair with terrifying speed. Her face was twisted into a mask of pure, irrational fury. She grabbed her oversized crystal wine glass, filled to the brim with expensive Chardonnay, and hurled it directly at me. The heavy glass narrowly missed my face by inches. It smashed violently against the hardwood floor right at my feet. Shards of sharp crystal exploded outward, scattering across the expensive Persian rug. Cold white wine splashed over the cuffs of my expensive tailored black trousers and slowly soaked deep into my Italian leather shoes. I did not flinch. I just looked down at the shattered glass, then slowly up at my mother. "You vindictive little girl!" Beatrice screamed, her voice tearing through the dining room. "You are trying to destroy him. You have always been jealous of him. From the day you were born, you could not stand that he was brilliant and you were nothing. You orchestrated this entire lie just to ruin his life because you have absolutely nothing going for yourself." Beatrice was hyperventilating now, clutching the edge of the dining table with white knuckles. She glared at me with genuine hatred. "Get out of my house," she demanded. "Get out now before I call the police and have you arrested." Jasmine did not even blink at my mother's screaming. She simply reached out, picked up her own pristine linen napkin, and dabbed a stray drop of wine from the polished mahogany table. When she finally spoke, her voice was dangerously low, carrying the weight of a seasoned executive who regularly dismantled billion-dollar corporations before lunch. "Sit down and be quiet," Beatrice Jasmine commanded. She did not raise her voice, but the sheer authority in her tone caused my mother to freeze mid-breath. "If you reach for a telephone to call the authorities tonight, the only person leaving this dining room in the back of a police cruiser will be your golden boy. Now sit down." Beatrice, trembling and entirely stripped of her perceived power, slowly sank back into her dining chair. She stared at Jasmine in sheer terror. Jasmine turned her attention entirely to my brother. Spencer was breathing heavily, his eyes darting frantically toward the front door, as if calculating his chances of making a run for it. But Jasmine leaned forward, lacing her fingers together, trapping him in her corporate crosshairs. "Let us put the theatrics aside and talk about the math," Spencer Jasmine said, her tone surgical and cold. "Your initial pitch deck claimed a monthly burn rate of $150,000. You stated you had an 18-month runway before needing Series A funding. But if $2.4 million was just suddenly wired to an offshore shell company in the Cayman Islands, your runway is not 18 months. Your runway is effectively zero. So explain the math to me. Where is the capital coming from to cover your payroll next week?" Spencer swallowed audibly. He tugged at his silk tie, suddenly looking as though he were suffocating. He opened his mouth, but instead of producing a coherent financial strategy, a jumble of desperate Silicon Valley buzzwords tumbled out. "Well, you see, Jasmine, we are operating in a highly agile synergistic paradigm," Spencer stammered, sweat now visibly shining on his forehead. "The offshore allocation was an aggressive bootstrapping maneuver to leverage decentralized assets. It allows us to pivot dynamically. The core infrastructure is sound. We just need your bridge capital to optimize the user acquisition funnel." Jasmine stared at him. The silence was agonizing. Even Beatrice looked confused by the sheer volume of meaningless jargon her son was spewing across the table. "A synergistic paradigm," Jasmine repeated flatly. "Spencer, you are not pitching an app to a group of naive college students in a dorm room. You are talking to a venture capital managing partner. You just used a string of buzzwords to avoid admitting that you do not even know how to read your own balance sheet. You have absolutely no business acumen. You are a fraud wearing a $5,000 suit." Spencer physically flinched as if he had been struck. His chest heaved. The grand illusion he had spent his entire life building, the genius entrepreneur narrative my mother had sacrificed my college education to fund, was being systematically dismantled over a plate of roasted turkey. He looked at Jasmine, realizing that his charm, his looks, and his practiced confidence were completely useless against her intellect. So he panicked. He realized he could not defend the numbers, so he decided to attack the source of the data. His eyes locked onto me wide with a manic, desperate energy. "You did this?" Spencer hissed, his voice trembling with rage. He pushed himself away from the table, his chair scraping violently against the hardwood floor. He pointed a shaking finger directly at my face. You could not stand seeing me succeed. You could not stand that Mom chose to invest in my future instead of your pathetic, mediocre life. I sat perfectly still, completely ignoring the white wine soaking into my leather shoes. I did not make the offshore wire transfer, Spencer. You did. I did no such thing, Spencer shouted, his voice echoing off the vaulted ceilings. He turned to Jasmine, his eyes wide and pleading for her to believe his desperate lies. Jasmine, you have to listen to me right now. She is a forensic accountant. She knows how to manipulate complex financial systems. She hates me. She has hated me since we were young children. She knew you were coming over tonight, and she orchestrated this entire thing to ruin my reputation. Beatrice gasped, immediately latching on to this new convenient narrative to save her son. Yes, she cried out, slamming her hand on the table. Madeline is a hacker. She set him up. Spencer leaned over the dining table, his face inches from mine, his breath hot and ragged. My own sister illegally hacked my personal laptop and fabricated all the fake evidence to frame me for wire fraud. Spencer let his voice break on the final word, dropping his head into his hands to complete the performance of a broken, betrayed man. He squeezed his eyes shut, forcing a single pathetic tear to roll down his cheek. He looked up at Jasmine, his expression a carefully constructed mask of profound sorrow. You have to understand the family dynamic we have been dealing with for decades, Jasmine. He pleaded, his voice trembling with manufactured emotion. Madeline has always been unwell. She is a pathological liar. She has this deep psychological obsession with destroying any happiness or success I manage to achieve. He stood up slowly, leaning against the table, as if the weight of my supposed betrayal was physically crushing him. When I graduated high school with top honors, she purposefully destroyed my valedictorian speech. When I got accepted into my first incubator program, she called the directors and spread malicious rumors about my mental stability. She cannot stand the fact that I built something from nothing while she is stuck in a miserable, lonely corporate grind. She saw my laptop open in the study when she arrived today. She must have planted those files to make me look like a criminal. She wants to see me lose everything. Beatrice nodded vigorously, her hands clasped together in a prayer of desperation. It is true, Jasmine, my mother cried out, her voice echoing with theatrical grief. We have tried to get her psychiatric help so many times. We have offered to pay for the best therapists in Connecticut. But she refuses to change. She is toxic. She is a danger to this family and to your firm. You must not listen to a single word she says. She is entirely detached from reality. Spencer wiped his face, suddenly standing tall, trying to reclaim his authoritative posture. He pointed a rigid finger toward the front door. I will not allow you to poison my life for one more second, Madeline. He commanded, his voice echoing loudly. Get out of my house. I want you out of my sight right now. Leave your keys on the counter and never come back. You are dead to me. Jasmine sat motionless, her sharp eyes darting between my brother's tear-stained face and my mother's dramatic sobbing. To an ordinary observer, their performance might have been convincing. They had 30 years of practice playing the victims, 30 years of twisting the narrative to make me the villain in every single family dispute. But Jasmine was not an ordinary observer. She built her entire career on reading people, on separating emotional manipulation from cold, hard facts. She looked at me, waiting to see if I would break under the immense psychological pressure. I did not break. I did not move toward the door. I did not shed a single tear or raise my voice to defend myself against their absurd psychiatric accusations. I simply reached into my black designer leather briefcase, resting on the floor beside my chair. You are right about one thing, Spencer, I said, calmly pulling out my sleek silver iPad. You did leave your laptop open in the study, but I did not need to touch it. Forensic accountants do not need physical access to a personal computer to track stolen venture capital. We use bank subpoenas and server logs. And unfortunately for your little victim narrative, server logs do not lie. I tapped the screen of my tablet. With a swift, fluid motion, I swiped my finger upward. A sharp electronic chime echoed through the first floor. In the adjacent living room, perfectly visible through the wide dining room archway, the massive 85-inch smart television flashed on. My mother gasped as the bright light illuminated the dark room. I had wirelessly mirrored my iPad screen directly to the family television. I did not need to shout over their lies. I was going to let the federal evidence speak for itself in high definition. "Look at the screen, Spencer," I commanded, my voice carrying the absolute authority of a senior partner. On the massive display, a highly detailed digital banking ledger appeared. It was the official portal of the Cayman Islands Banking Authority, carrying authentic watermarks and secure verification codes. Right in the center of the screen, highlighted in bright yellow, was the $2.4 million wire transfer. But that was not the part that made Spencer stop breathing. Below the transfer confirmation, I projected the digital IP address log. It displayed the exact geographic location of the device that had authorized the fraudulent transfer. I looked at my brother, whose face had turned the color of ash. "You did not authorize this transfer from a hacked laptop in Connecticut, Spencer. The IP address originates from Miami Beach." The 85-inch screen dominated the room, glowing with undeniable proof of federal wire fraud. Spencer stared at the high-definition display of the Cayman Islands banking portal, his mouth hanging open. The IP address logged in Miami Beach matched perfectly with his yacht broker's location. The digital footprint was absolute. The narrative he had spent 30 years cultivating, that he was the responsible, brilliant golden boy, and I was the unstable, jealous failure, collapsed right in front of the one person he needed to impress the most. Jasmine slowly rose from the heavy oak dining chair. She did not raise her voice. She did not yell. She simply buttoned the front of her tailored charcoal suit jacket, her movements precise and deliberate. She looked at Spencer not with anger, but with the cold, detached professionalism of a corporate executioner. "Spencer," Jasmine said, her voice slicing through the heavy silence of the room, "as the managing partner of Vanguard Capital, I am officially informing you that all negotiations regarding our proposed $20 million merger are suspended immediately. We will not be proceeding with the term sheet. Furthermore, as a fiduciary operating under the Securities and Exchange Commission, my firm is legally obligated to report any confirmed discovery of financial fraud to the appropriate federal authorities. We will be initiating a full external audit of your operations by tomorrow morning." Spencer stumbled backward, physically reeling from the impact of her words. "Jasmine, no, you cannot do this," he begged, his voice cracking into a high, desperate pitch. "It is a misunderstanding. I can fix the books. I can get the money back. Just give me 48 hours. Do not report this. It will destroy everything I have built. It will destroy my life. You destroyed your own life the second you wired seed capital to buy a yacht," Jasmine replied flatly. She turned away from him and picked up her expensive designer handbag from the floor. She did not look back. "Have your legal counsel contact my office. Do not attempt to contact me personally again." The absolute finality of her words severed the last thread of Spencer's sanity. The charming, sophisticated tech entrepreneur vanished entirely. The mask slipped off, revealing the deeply entitled, aggressive narcissist my mother had spent decades enabling. Spencer let out a guttural scream of pure rage. He turned away from Jasmine and lunged toward the dining table. His eyes were wild, completely devoid of reason. He grabbed the stack of heavy porcelain dinner plates I had carried out earlier, the ones my mother had shoved into my hands when I arrived. He lifted the entire stack high above his head with both hands. "You did this to me," he roared. His face twisted into an ugly, unrecognizable snarl. He hurled the entire stack of porcelain plates directly at the living room wall. The impact was deafening. The plates shattered violently against the custom drywall, sending hundreds of sharp, jagged shards flying across the room. Framed family photos plummeted to the floor, glass cracking under the force of the explosion. The beautiful, pristine suburban home my mother prized above all else was instantly transformed into a chaotic war zone. Beatrice screamed, covering her ears and dropping to her knees by the dining table. "Spencer, stop it!" But Spencer could not stop. He was completely unhinged. He grabbed a heavy silver serving spoon and violently swept it across the dining table, knocking over crystal wine glasses, silver gravy boats, and bowls of hot side dishes. Food and wine splattered against the expensive wallpaper. He was destroying everything in his path, screaming obscenities, blaming me, blaming Jasmine, blaming the world for not recognizing his supposed genius. He kicked a dining chair so hard that the wooden leg snapped in half. I stood perfectly still watching my brother have a violent meltdown in a $5,000 suit. I did not flinch when a piece of broken porcelain skidded across the floor and hit my shoe. I just watched him tear down his own kingdom. Jasmine stopped at the front door. She did not run away in fear. She simply turned her head, pulled her smartphone from her handbag, and quietly tapped a button on the screen, her eyes fixed entirely on Spencer's violent rampage. She was documenting every single second of his destruction. Beatrice, sobbing hysterically on the floor among the broken glass and spilled wine, realized that her son was seconds away from an assault charge. She knew she had to regain control of the narrative before Jasmine called the police. She crawled through the mess, ignoring the wine soaking into her dress, and scrambled toward the heavy oak door of her husband's old study. Beatrice disappeared into the dark room for a few seconds. When she emerged, she was no longer crying. Her face was set in a mask of cold, desperate determination. She marched back into the destroyed dining room, stepping over the shattered plates. In her shaking hand, she held a thick, yellowed manila envelope sealed with red wax. Beatrice stood amidst the shattered porcelain and ruined dinner, her breath coming in ragged gasps. She clutched the thick, yellowed envelope to her chest, as if it were a literal shield against the reality of her son's federal financial crimes. Spencer was still violently kicking the remnants of a wooden chair in the corner of the dining room, his chest heaving with exertion. But my mother completely ignored his unhinged display. In her frantic mind, she had just found the ultimate solution to fix his multi-million-dollar mistake. She marched over to the dining table, her expensive heels crunching loudly over the broken crystal wine glasses. With a forceful sweep of her arm, she pushed aside a spilled silver gravy boat and a scattered pile of roasted asparagus, clearing a wide space on the wet mahogany surface. She slammed the heavy manila envelope down so hard that the sound echoed like a gunshot over Spencer's heavy, panicked breathing. "Jasmine, you need to look at this right now!" Beatrice commanded, her voice trembling, but laced with a sudden, desperate arrogance. She reached out and brutally snapped the red wax seal with her perfectly manicured thumbnail. "You said his company has zero runway. You said he has absolutely no capital to secure your firm's $20 million investment. Well, you are completely wrong." Jasmine lowered her smartphone, having successfully recorded over 3 minutes of Spencer's violent meltdown. She did not put the phone away, keeping it securely gripped in her hand, but she turned her cold, calculating gaze toward my mother. I watched quietly as Beatrice frantically pulled a thick stack of legal documents from the envelope. The heavy parchment paper was stamped with the official seal of the state of Connecticut. I recognized the paperwork immediately. It was the Vance Family Trust established by my late father decades ago. "This is the master trust document for our entire estate," Beatrice announced, her voice rising with a triumphant theatrical flair. She smoothed the wrinkled pages flat against the wet table, her eyes darting between Jasmine and me. "It contains the deed to this house, which is entirely paid off and valued at nearly $2 million in today's market. It also holds our remaining liquid assets, the family investment portfolios, and the vintage car collection currently sitting out in the garage." Spencer stopped kicking the broken chair. He slowly turned around, his tie completely undone. His face flushed red. He stared at the documents on the table, a sudden glimmer of greedy hope cutting through his absolute panic. He wiped the sweat from his forehead and took a tentative step toward his mother. "Under the original terms of this trust, the assets were meant to be divided equally between my two children upon my passing." Beatrice continued, glaring directly at me with a look of pure, unadulterated malice. But as the sole surviving executor of this estate, I possess the legal authority to amend the distribution of these assets in the event of extreme family emergency or gross misconduct by a beneficiary. She pointed a shaking accusatory finger directly at my face, her cheeks flushed with vindictive rage. And attempting to frame your own brother for federal wire fraud, destroying his business reputation in front of his investors, and trying to tear this family apart is the absolute definition of gross misconduct. Beatrice turned back to Jasmine, slapping her hand proudly on the thick stack of legal papers. As of this exact second, I am officially disinheriting Madeline from the Vance Family Trust. I am stripping her of every single penny, every piece of property, and every legal right she has to this family's legacy. She gets absolutely nothing from me ever again. My mother then looked lovingly at Spencer, the grown man who had just destroyed her dining room, and lied to her face. I am legally transferring 100% of all family assets directly into Spencer's name effective immediately. He now has complete ownership of a $2 million estate. Beatrice stood tall, radiating a delusional sense of victory. She looked at Jasmine, fully expecting the venture capitalist to be impressed by this ruthless financial sacrifice. There is your bridge capital, Jasmine. My son is not bankrupt. He now has over $2 million in hard tangible assets to leverage for his startup company. He can use this estate as collateral. You have no reason to cancel the corporate merger, and you certainly have no reason to contact the federal authorities tonight. Spencer let out a breathless laugh of pure relief. He stumbled forward, throwing his arms around his mother, burying his face in her shoulder. "Thank you, Mom," he whispered. "I knew you would save me." Beatrice hugged him tightly, glaring at me. "You are finished, Madeline." The grand dining room fell entirely silent, save for the sound of my brother panting heavily and my mother waiting eagerly for my inevitable collapse. Beatrice stood tall, her chin raised, expecting me to fall to my knees. She expected tears begging and a desperate plea for forgiveness. She wanted me to apologize to her golden child. Instead, a sound escaped my throat that completely shattered her triumphant moment. I started laughing. It was not a hysterical or panicked laugh. It was a genuine deep chuckle that echoed off the ruined walls of the dining room. I reached across the table, carefully avoiding a puddle of spilled gravy, and pulled the heavy parchment paper toward me. I scanned the first few paragraphs of the trust, the laughter bubbling up again, completely out of my control. "Stop laughing!" Beatrice shrieked, her face twisting from arrogant victory back to pure, unadulterated rage. She slammed her hand flat on the wet mahogany table. "There is nothing funny about this, Madeline. You are entirely cut off. You are walking out of this house with nothing but the clothes on your back. How dare you laugh at me after what you just tried to do to your brother tonight?" Spencer stepped forward, his fists clenched tightly at his sides. He was terrified of my reaction. He had expected me to be crushed, but my amusement unsettled him to his core. "You are sick, Maddie." He spat out, his voice trembling slightly. "Mom just legally stripped you of $1 million and you think it is a joke. Get out. We do not need you here anymore. I have the estate now. Jasmine and I can move forward without your toxic interference." I slowly looked up from the document. I placed the parchment gently back onto the table and folded my hands neatly over it. I looked at my mother, whose chest was heaving with indignation, and then at my brother, who was clinging to this piece of paper like a life raft. "You did not read the fine print, Mother," I said, my voice cutting through their anger like a scalpel. "You never were very good at understanding legal jargon, were you? You just saw the words executor and transfer, and assumed you held absolute power over my life." Beatrice scoffed loudly, crossing her arms defensively. "I had my lawyers draft that document 20 years ago. It gives me absolute discretionary power over the estate assets. I do not need to read the fine print. I own the assets, and now Spencer owns them." I shook my head slowly, a pitying smile forming on my lips. "You do not own anything, Mother, and neither does Spencer." I picked up the second page of the trust document and held it up in the air. I cleared my throat, and began to read aloud, making sure my voice carried perfectly to where Jasmine was standing by the front door. Section 4, Paragraph B of the Family Trust I read clearly. The executor may transfer real property to a designated beneficiary provided that said property is transferred free and clear of all liens, mortgages, encumbrances, or third-party claims. Any attempt to transfer encumbered property under the guise of this trust shall render the transfer immediately null and void. I lowered the paper. Beatrice stared at me, her brow furrowed in deep confusion. She looked at the dense paragraphs of legal text, as if they were written in a foreign language. Her entire life, she had relied on men like my father to handle the complicated financial details, while she simply enjoyed the social privileges of wealth. She did not understand the legal terminology. She just knew that I was not acting like a defeated woman. "What does that even mean?" Beatrice demanded, her voice shrill. "The house is completely paid off. Your father and I paid the final mortgage installment 12 years ago. There are no liens on this property. It is free and clear, so the transfer to Spencer is perfectly legal." I did not look at my mother when I answered. I slowly turned my head and locked eyes with Spencer. He had stopped moving entirely. The temporary relief he felt just moments ago vanished into thin air. The color that had briefly returned to his face drained away again, leaving him looking like a ghost in a ruined designer suit. He understood exactly what I had just read. He understood the lethal trap his mother had inadvertently sprung on him by bringing out the trust document. I leaned forward, my voice dropping to a harsh, unforgiving whisper that somehow filled the entire room. "The house is supposed to be free and clear, Mother," I said, keeping my eyes fixed dead on my brother. "That was the condition of the trust. But I am a forensic accountant, and I do not just audit venture capital funds. When I saw Spencer wiring money offshore, I ran a full asset check on his entire portfolio. The house is not free and clear, Mother. There is a massive high-interest shadow mortgage placed on this exact property." Beatrice stared at me, her eyes darting as if trying to solve a complex puzzle. She looked down at the parchment paper under my hands, then over at her son. A nervous chuckle escaped her throat as she attempted to dismiss my statement. "That is completely impossible," Beatrice stated, waving her hand in the air. She took a slow, deliberate step toward the head of the dining table, her confidence artificially reinflated by her own desperate denial of the reality unfolding around her. "I have the original deed right here. I know exactly what our financial situation is. Your father and I worked too hard to secure this estate for you to invent a fictional mortgage. The house is fully paid off. There is no shadow mortgage. You are just trying to sound intimidating in front of Jasmine." She turned to Spencer, extending her hands, expecting him to join her in laughing off my claim. "Tell her, Spencer. Tell your sister how absurd she sounds right now. Tell her that this house belongs entirely to us, and that her accounting tricks cannot change the facts." But Spencer did not laugh. He did not step forward to agree with our mother's desperate pleas. He did not utter a single word of defense. Instead, the golden child was slowly backing away. His polished leather shoes scraped against the hardwood floor, inching backward toward the front door. The vibrant red flush of anger that fueled his destructive tantrum was entirely gone. His face was the color of old parchment. He looked like a man who had just stepped on a landmine waiting for the detonation. His eyes were wide, fixed entirely on the floor, unable to meet my gaze or his mother's expectant look. "Spencer." Beatrice said, her voice faltering as she registered his physical retreat. Her smile dropped as a cold sense of dread began to pool in her stomach. "Why are you backing up? Tell her she is wrong. We own this house." Spencer swallowed hard, the sound audible in the heavy silence. He reached up with a trembling hand and loosened his silk tie even further, pulling at his collar as if he were choking on the very air in the room. I leaned back, resting my arms comfortably on the armrests. I let the silence stretch, allowing Beatrice to watch her son's cowardly physical reaction. The truth was written in every line of his terrified posture. A shadow mortgage is a term used in the financial sector to describe a loan acquired through an unregulated private lending institution. I explained calmly, my voice cutting through the thick tension. These are not traditional banks, Mother. They are predatory lenders who provide massive amounts of liquid capital instantly. They do not care about credit scores or business plans. They only care about collateral. The collateral they require to approve these massive loans is always tangible, highly valuable hard assets. Specifically, they want prime real estate. Beatrice slowly turned her head back to look at me. The arrogant fire in her eyes was dimming, replaced by a terrifying uncertainty. She looked at the trust document on the table, then back at Spencer, who had now backed himself entirely against the living room wall. These private lenders charge exorbitant interest rates. I continued smoothly, painting the grim financial picture with absolute precision. They expect the borrower to default. In fact, their entire business model is built on the assumption that the borrower will fail to make the payments. Because when the borrower defaults, the lender immediately seizes the collateral. It is a highly efficient way to acquire multi-million-dollar properties for a fraction of their market value. Beatrice raised a shaking hand to her mouth. She took a step toward her son, her high heels crunching over the broken crystal wine glasses scattered across the floor. "Spencer, look at me," she pleaded, her voice cracking with raw panic. "What is she talking about? Tell me she is making this up. Tell me you did not touch the deed to this house." Spencer pressed his back against the wall, his chest heaving. He looked like a trapped animal. He squeezed his eyes shut, shaking his head rapidly side to side, silently begging to be awoken from this nightmare. Jasmine had not moved from the doorway. She had watched the exchange with the sharp gaze of a predator observing wounded prey. She lowered her smartphone, slipping it into her handbag. She had seen enough meltdowns from founders to know what a guilty man looked like. She read his body language with flawless accuracy. Jasmine took one step forward, her presence instantly demanding attention. She looked at him, her voice dropping to a commanding register that echoed with absolute authority. "What did you leverage, Spencer?" The question hung in the air, heavy and inescapable. "What did you leverage, Spencer?" Jasmine asked again, her voice completely devoid of sympathy. She already knew the answer, but she wanted to hear him say it aloud, in front of the mother who had enabled him. Spencer looked at the powerful woman he had spent weeks trying to impress. He saw the cold disgust in her eyes and finally understood that there would be no $20 million bailout. There would be no merger. Vanguard Capital was not going to save him. The elaborate corporate fantasy he had built for himself was completely dead. The realization did not bring him to a place of remorse or accountability. Instead, it triggered a massive explosion of pure narcissistic rage. He pushed himself off the wall, his chest heaving as he scanned the ruined dining room. His wild eyes bypassed me entirely and locked onto our mother. Beatrice was still standing near the head of the table, clutching the now useless trust documents in her trembling hands. "I leveraged the house." Mom, Spencer screamed, his voice cracking violently. "I leveraged this massive, empty, pointless house because you did not give me enough cash to keep my company afloat." Beatrice physically recoiled as if he had struck her across the face. Her mouth opened, but no sound came out. She stared at the son she worshipped, unable to process the betrayal. "Do not look at me like that," Spencer roared, stalking toward her, kicking a broken crystal wine glass out of his path. "You told me I was a genius. You told me to do whatever it takes to scale the business. Scaling a tech startup costs real money, Mom. Not that pathetic little college fund you stole from Madeline 10 years ago. That barely covered my first office lease. I needed millions to keep the developers on payroll and maintain the image of a successful founder." He was pacing now like a cornered animal. "When the venture capital market dried up last year, traditional banks laughed me out of their offices," Spencer continued. "They wanted to see actual revenue and profit margins. I could not let the industry know I was completely broke, so I found a private equity lender, a shadow bank based out of New York. They did not care about credit scores. They only asked for collateral. They asked for something tangible they could seize immediately if I missed a payment. Beatrice dropped the parchment papers onto the wet mahogany table. Her hands began to shake uncontrollably. "Spencer, what did you do?" she whispered, her voice barely audible. "I took out a $3 million shadow mortgage against the estate," he confessed, throwing his arms wide open in twisted defiance. "They gave me a high-risk loan with a 20% interest rate. It was supposed to be a bridge loan just to keep the lights on until Jasmine finalized the Vanguard merger. It was supposed to be temporary." He pointed an accusing finger at Beatrice. "But you dragged this entire process out. You wanted to play the grand hostess tonight. Now Jasmine is pulling the term sheet. The lenders are calling in the debt by the end of the month." The sheer scale of his recklessness crashed into the room, creating an atmosphere of suffocating dread. $3 million at 20% interest was an absolute financial death sentence for this family. He had secretly gambled away the family home to cover his operating budget and his completely fabricated luxurious lifestyle. He had burned every single safety net, destroyed his own credibility, and now he was aggressively blaming the very mother who had enabled him and funded his delusions since he was a young boy. Beatrice began to hyperventilate uncontrollably. Her chest rose and fell in rapid, painfully shallow gasps. The grand matriarch, who had proudly disinherited me just 3 minutes ago, was now helplessly watching her entire world burn to the ground. She gripped the edge of the mahogany dining table so hard her knuckles turned stark white against the wood. Her perfect suburban life, her prestigious country club status, her flawless social reputation, everything she valued was gone. "But that is legally impossible." Beatrice gasped, her eyes wide with unadulterated terror. She shook her head frantically back and forth, completely refusing to accept the severity of his financial crime. "The title insurance company would strictly require my written authorization to process a loan of that magnitude. You simply cannot place a shadow mortgage on a piece of residential property you do not own." She lunged forward, grabbing Spencer by the lapels of his ruined designer suit jacket. "I am the sole owner of this estate, Spencer. I am the executor. I never signed any legal loan documents." Spencer looked down at his mother's hands, gripping the lapels of his ruined suit. There was no affection left in his eyes. There was no guilt. He simply saw an obstacle, an old woman who had outlived her financial usefulness to him. With a swift, brutal motion, he reached up and shoved her hands away. Beatrice stumbled backward, her high heels slipping on the spilled wine, and she fell hard against the heavy oak dining chair. She gasped, grabbing her bruised arm, staring up at the son she had worshipped for over 3 decades. "I signed them for you," Spencer said. His voice was completely flat, devoid of any warmth or hesitation. It was the cold, calculating tone of a true narcissist who believed he was entirely justified in his actions. "It was not even difficult, Mom. You keep all your important paperwork in that stupid unlocked safe in the study. You gave me the combination years ago so I could fetch your jewelry. I took the original deed, brought it to a notary who owed me a favor, and I signed your name on every single dotted line." Beatrice let out a strangled sob, pressing her hand over her mouth. "You forged my signature," she whispered, the reality of the felony finally penetrating her deep denial. "You committed a crime to steal the house your father built for us." Spencer scoffed, rolling his eyes as if her devastation was merely an annoying inconvenience. "Oh, please spare me the dramatic victim routine, Mom," he snapped, taking a step toward her, his posture aggressive and threatening. "You forced me to do this. This is entirely your fault. My fault." Beatrice cried out, her voice breaking. "Yes, your fault." Spencer roared, the veins bulging in his neck. "You raised me to be a king. You paraded me around your country club friends, bragging about my genius, demanding that I become a tech billionaire so you could look good. You wanted the prestige, the magazine covers, and the bragging rights. But when it came time to actually fund my vision, you were perfectly happy to sit on a $2 million estate while I drowned in operating costs. You hoarded the wealth. If you had just signed the house over to me a year ago, I would not have had to go behind your back. I had to forge your signature because you were too selfish to give me what I deserved." The ultimate betrayal hung in the air, heavy and suffocating. Beatrice sat frozen on the floor, the shards of broken crystal digging into her knees. The illusion of the perfect golden child shattered into a million irreparable pieces. Spencer did not love her. He never had. He only loved what she could provide for him. And the moment she failed to provide enough, he casually destroyed her life and blamed her for it. The mother who had stolen my future to fund his dreams was now bankrupt and homeless, destroyed by the very monster she had so carefully created and enabled. I watched her weep, feeling absolutely nothing at all. I had spent 30 years being the scapegoat, the punching bag for their twisted dynamic. Now the dynamic had imploded, and the collateral damage was entirely theirs to bear. Jasmine had remained silent, watching the grotesque display of family betrayal with the clinical detachment of a scientist observing a toxic chemical reaction. She had heard enough. She did not need to ask any more questions. The confession was explicit audio recorded on her device and witnessed by multiple people. She reached into her tailored suit jacket and pulled out her sleek smartphone. She did not walk out of the room. She stood right in the center of the ruined dining area, directly in front of Spencer, and tapped the screen. She pressed the speakerphone button and turned the volume all the way up to maximum. A sharp ringing tone echoed through the silent house, cutting through the sound of Beatrice weeping on the floor. After 2 rings, a crisp, professional male voice answered. Vanguard Capital Legal Department. This is Attorney David speaking. Jasmine kept her eyes locked entirely on my terrified brother. David, it is Jasmine. I need you to initiate an immediate hard stop on the Spencer Vance term sheet. Pull all the paperwork from the escrow accounts right now. Understood. Jasmine. The lawyer replied smoothly, the sound broadcasting loudly across the dining room. May I ask the official reason for the abrupt termination for our compliance records? Jasmine did not blink. She leaned slightly forward, making sure the microphone picked up her voice with absolute clarity. You can record the official reason as admitted federal wire fraud and the criminal forgery of real estate deeds. The merger is completely dead. The speakerphone clicked off, severing the connection. The abrupt silence in the ruined dining room was more deafening than the shatter of the porcelain plates. Jasmine casually slipped her sleek smartphone back into her tailored jacket pocket, her face a mask of absolute indifference. She had just effectively signed Spencer's corporate death warrant, and she looked as though she had simply crossed an item off her grocery list. Spencer stared at the space where the phone had been, his mind violently rejecting the reality of the last 60 seconds. The $20 million term sheet was gone. His startup was dead. The federal authorities were going to be notified in the morning. His entire fraudulent empire had been reduced to ashes before the main course was even served. A low guttural growl began in the back of his throat. It was not the sound of a sophisticated tech founder. It was the sound of a cornered predator, realizing it had no escape. He raised his head, his eyes locking onto Jasmine with a terrifying predatory intensity. You vindictive bitch, Spencer hissed, his voice vibrating with pure malice. He lunged forward. His polished leather shoes kicked aside the broken dining chair as he closed the distance between them. His hands curled into tight fists, his broad shoulders tensed for physical violence. He was no longer trying to charm the venture capitalist. He wanted to physically punish the woman who had dared to strip him of his unearned power. He wanted to destroy the person holding him accountable. I did not even hesitate. I moved before he could take a second step. I stepped firmly directly into his path, placing myself squarely between my raging brother and Jasmine. I planted my feet on the hardwood floor, my posture rigidly straight. I did not raise my hands to defend myself. I did not shrink back. I stood my ground, establishing an absolute immovable physical boundary that he had never encountered from me before. Get out of my way, Madeline! Spencer roared, his face inches from mine. Flecks of spit flew from his lips, landing on my cheek. I will tear her apart. I will ruin her firm for doing this to me. Move right now, or I swear I will make you regret it. I stared directly into his wild, bloodshot eyes. I did not flinch. Take one more step, Spencer. I said, my voice completely devoid of emotion, cold and sharp as a razor blade. I dare you to take one single step closer. He breathed heavily, his chest heaving up and down, his fists shaking with the urge to strike me. He towered over me, trying to use his physical size to intimidate me the way he had done when we were children. But we were not children anymore. I was not the scared little girl he could lock in a closet, and he was not the untouchable golden boy. I was a professional who dismantled corrupt billionaires for a living. His pathetic temper tantrum did not frighten me in the slightest. If you lay a single finger on her, or on me, I continued, my voice echoing clearly in the silent room, I will not wait for the SEC to audit your company. I will call the local police right now. You will be arrested for aggravated assault added directly to your federal wire fraud and forgery charges. You will not leave this house in a luxury car. You will leave in handcuffs, and you will spend the night in a concrete holding cell. Make your choice right now. Spencer stared at me, his jaw clenched so tightly I could hear his teeth grinding. He looked at my unwavering gaze, then glanced over my shoulder at Jasmine, who was watching him with absolute disgust. He realized, in that fraction of a second, that his physical intimidation tactics were entirely useless. He was completely powerless against women who were not afraid of him. Slowly, the tension drained from his broad shoulders. He took a half-step backward, his hands uncurling from their fists hanging uselessly by his sides. But the retreat did not bring clarity or remorse. Instead, his mind snapped completely under the immense pressure of his total defeat. A strange, twisted smile slowly spread across his pale face. The smile broke into a soft chuckle, which rapidly escalated into a loud, hysterical laugh. He stood in the middle of the destroyed dining room, surrounded by broken glass, smashed china, and spilled wine, throwing his head back and laughing like a madman. Beatrice whimpered from the floor, terrified by the unhinged sound coming from her favorite child. "You think you won?" "Maddie Spencer," gasped out between bouts of manic laughter, his eyes wild and unfocused. "You think you are so incredibly smart, standing there in your expensive clothes playing the hero to the big corporate boss. You think you took me down and saved the day." He wiped a tear of hysterical amusement from his eye, pointing a shaking accusatory finger directly at my chest. "You lose too," he sneered, his voice dripping with venomous triumph. "You think you can just walk away from this mess unscathed? I did not just leverage the house. I defaulted on the payments. I have not paid the shadow bank a single dime in 3 months. The final grace period expired yesterday afternoon. The private lenders are legally foreclosing on the estate tomorrow morning." He spread his arms wide, gesturing grandly to the beautiful, opulent home my mother prized above all else. "They are coming to change the locks tomorrow." Spencer laughed. "You, me, Mom. We are all going down together. The bank is taking everything, and we are all going to be entirely homeless." The echo of Spencer's hysterical laughter faded into the vaulted ceilings of the ruined dining room, leaving behind a silence so heavy it felt difficult to breathe. He stood there amidst the wreckage, a vacant smile plastered across his face. He had completely surrendered to the destruction. He accepted the loss of his company and our family home with a twisted sense of relief, indifferent to the collateral damage he inflicted on his mother. Beatrice stared at her golden child, her eyes wide and bloodshot. The absolute certainty of his words finally shattered the last remaining wall of her denial. They were going to be homeless. The sprawling colonial house with its manicured lawns, the heated swimming pool, the endless expensive renovations she used to impress the local homeowner association. All of it was going to be seized by a faceless private equity firm in less than 24 hours. The prestigious country club memberships would be revoked. The social dominance she had spent her entire adult life cultivating would vanish overnight. She would be exposed to her wealthy friends as a total fraud, a bankrupt woman whose genius son was nothing more than a common criminal who forged her name. The sheer weight of this reality physically crushed her. Beatrice let out a long, agonizing wail, a sound completely stripped of her usual theatrical elegance. Her legs gave out completely. She collapsed onto her knees, the expensive fabric of her designer dress soaking up the spilled Chardonnay and brown gravy pooling on the hardwood floor. She did not even seem to notice the sharp shards of crystal wine glasses digging into her bare skin. She just knelt there, weeping uncontrollably, her perfectly styled hair falling in messy strands across her tear-stained face. Spencer did not move to comfort her. He did not even look at her. He just stared blankly at the shattered porcelain plates scattered against the far wall, lost in his own narcissism. Then slowly, Beatrice lifted her head. Her expensive mascara was running in dark, ugly streaks down her cheeks. Her desperate, panic-stricken eyes frantically searched the room for a lifeline, for anyone to save her from the consequences of her own terrible parenting choices. Her gaze bypassed Spencer entirely. She looked past Jasmine, who was still standing quietly by the doorway, watching the spectacular collapse with clinical detachment. Her eyes locked squarely onto me. Minutes ago, this exact woman had forced a catering apron into my chest. She had called my career a depressing little bookkeeping job. She had hurled a heavy crystal glass directly at my face and joyfully declared that she was legally stripping me of my entire inheritance. But extreme desperation breeds the most profound form of hypocrisy. Beatrice scrambled forward on her hands and knees. She crawled over the ruined dinner, ignoring the mess, until she reached where I was standing. She reached up with trembling, wine-soaked hands and violently grabbed my wrists. Her grip was surprisingly strong, fueled by absolute terror of losing her status. "Madeline, please, Beatrice," sobbed her voice, cracking with raw, unadulterated panic. "You have to save us. You are a senior partner." Jasmine just said you are a senior partner at a massive financial firm in New York. You must make an absolute fortune. You have the money. You have the high-level connections to fix this nightmare. You can pay off this shadow bank, Beatrice begged, squeezing my wrists tighter, shaking my arms frantically to emphasize her plea. You have a fancy accountant salary. You can wire the funds tomorrow morning and stop the foreclosure process. We can kick Spencer out. I will kick him out of this house tonight, I swear it to you. It will just be you and me, Madeline. I will tear up those trust documents. I will put the deed entirely in your name. Just write the check. You cannot let them throw your own mother out onto the street. Please, Maddie, you are the smart one. You have always been the smart one. Save your family." The audacity of her words was almost poetic in its cruelty. She was perfectly willing to throw her beloved golden boy out into the cold the second he stopped being financially useful to her. And she was perfectly willing to shower me with empty praise the second she needed access to my bank account. There was no apology for a lifetime of emotional abuse. There was only a desperate financial transaction. I stared down at her tear-stained, hypocritical face. I felt the cold grip of her hands on my skin. I did not feel a single ounce of pity. I reached down, firmly grabbed her wrists, and physically pried her hands off me. "I can't pay them off, Mother." The physical rejection of her grip sent a violent shockwave through Beatrice. The moment my words registered in her panicked mind, the pathetic weeping mother vanished completely. The transition was terrifyingly instantaneous and entirely predictable. Her tear-stained face hardened instantly, the desperate pleading in her eyes freezing into absolute venomous hatred. She realized that her emotional manipulation, a calculated tactic that had worked flawlessly on my father and everyone else in her elite country club circle for decades, held absolutely no power over me anymore. She pushed herself up from the ruined floor, her wine-soaked designer dress clinging awkwardly to her legs, ignoring the sharp crystal shards that fell from her lap and clattered onto the hardwood. "You selfish, ungrateful little wretch!" Beatrice spat, her voice dropping into a harsh, trembling growl that filled the space between us. She pointed a shaking, manicured finger directly at my face, her eyes blazing. "After everything I have done for you, after I put a heavy roof over your head, fed you, clothed you, and tolerated your miserable, gloomy presence in my beautiful house for 18 years, you finally have a clear chance to repay your massive debt to this family, to save us from absolute financial ruin, and you are going to stand there and hoard your corporate wealth, just to spite me." I watched her chest heave with intense indignation. She was not humiliated by Spencer's federal crimes. She was infuriated by my refusal to clean up his mess. You have always been a bitter, jealous disappointment. Beatrice screamed, stepping closer to me aggressively, trying to use her physical presence to intimidate me into submission. You could never stand the fact that Spencer was destined for absolute greatness. You hated him simply because he was charismatic, because he was deeply loved by everyone, and because he possessed the brilliant entrepreneurial spark that you completely lacked. You scraped your way into a boring corporate accounting job, and now you think you can look down on us. She gestured wildly around the destroyed dining room, her voice echoing off the vaulted ceilings and the broken chandelier. You want to see us out on the cold streets, do you not? You want to see your own flesh and blood brother, sleeping in a dirty homeless shelter. You want to see me completely humiliated in front of the entire neighborhood, stripped of my beautiful home and my hard-earned dignity. This is your sick, twisted fantasy finally coming to life. You orchestrated this entire financial audit just to corner him in front of Jasmine. You probably tipped off the shadow bank yourself to accelerate the foreclosure process. You are a monster, Madeline. A cold, calculating monster. Spencer was still laughing softly in the dark corner, thoroughly detached from reality, while Jasmine watched my mother's unhinged meltdown with cold, evaluating eyes. Beatrice took one final furious step toward me, her face inches from mine. I am entirely done with you, she declared, her voice ringing with absolute chilling finality. I am officially done trying to love a daughter who has no heart and no sense of basic family loyalty. You are dead to me, Madeline. Do you hear me? I have absolutely no daughter. When the bank executives come to foreclose on this magnificent estate tomorrow morning, I want you to know that the blood of this family's destruction is entirely on your hands. Never speak to me again. The grand dramatic disownment was meant to shatter me completely. It was specifically designed to make me fall to my knees, beg frantically for her forgiveness, and immediately write a $3 million check just to earn back her conditional maternal love. But I felt absolutely nothing inside. No grief, no sorrow, no lingering desire for her approval. Her vicious words were just empty noise echoing inside a house that she legally no longer owned. I looked at the pathetic woman who had stolen my college savings fund, who had constantly belittled my existence to prop up her golden child, and who had tried to strip me of my inheritance to save a criminal from federal prison. I did not raise my voice in retaliation. I did not offer a tear for her to feed on. I simply turned away from her screaming face and looked down at the floor. I reached down, my hands perfectly steady, and grasped the heavy brass zipper of my bag. I slowly unzipped my designer leather briefcase, the sharp metallic sound cutting effortlessly through the heavy tension in the dining room. You misunderstand me, Beatrice, I said, my voice eerily calm and perfectly measured as I reached inside. I didn't say I wouldn't pay them off. I said I can't. Beatrice stared at my hands, her brow furrowed in deep confusion. She could not process the distinction between refusing to pay and being unable to pay. In her mind, my corporate salary was an endless well of liquid cash that existed solely to rescue her golden child. She opened her mouth to argue, to launch into another tirade about my supposed selfishness, but the words died in her throat. From the depths of my black leather bag, I withdrew a massive, thick legal binder. It was bound in heavy, dark leather and secured with a bright red tag, the universal corporate indicator for an executed financial foreclosure. Etched into the center of the dark cover in crisp gold foil lettering was the logo of Aegis Capital Lending. I held the heavy binder in my hands for a brief moment, letting the weight of it anchor me entirely to the present reality. This was the grand culmination of months of silent, meticulous work. This was the inescapable trap my older brother had so arrogantly walked right into. I did not hand the binder to my mother. I stepped past her kneeling form and walked closer to where Spencer was standing. He had stopped laughing. The manic energy that had fueled his destructive tantrum evaporated the second he saw the gold lettering on the cover. He recognized the logo immediately. It was the logo printed on the top of the loan documents he had forged. It was the exact name of the shadow bank that was coming to seize his home tomorrow morning. I held the binder out over the ruined floor. I let go. The heavy leather-bound document fell with a loud, sickening thud, landing squarely on top of the shattered porcelain dinner plates right at Spencer's feet. A fine cloud of white dust rose from the broken china. "That is your shadow mortgage, Spencer," I said, my voice echoing in the silent room. "That is the complete financial record of the $3 million bridge loan you secured at a 20% interest rate. It contains every forged signature, every falsified asset declaration, and the official notice of default that was finalized yesterday afternoon." Spencer stared down at the binder, as if it were a venomous snake preparing to strike. He took a small step backward, his eyes wide with a new, distinct kind of terror. "How do you have that?" he whispered, his voice trembling so badly he could barely form the words. "Those are highly confidential internal bank documents. You are just a forensic accountant for Vanguard. You cannot legally access the private loan files of an entirely different lending institution." I smiled. It was not a warm smile. It was the cold, calculated smile of an executioner finally pulling the lever. "Pick it up, Spencer," I commanded. He shook his head rapidly, his hands raised defensively in front of his chest. "No, I am not touching that." "How did you get it?" I did not raise my voice, but the absolute authority in my tone made him flinch. I said, "Pick it up. Open the binder. Go to the final execution page and read the name of the managing partner aloud for our mother to hear. Read the exact name of the person who personally approved your fraudulent loan." Beatrice scrambled to her feet, her wine-soaked dress clinging awkwardly to her legs. "Spencer, what is she talking about?" she cried out, her voice frantic and shrill. "Just open the book and see what it says. We need to know how she got this information. We need to know who we are dealing with." Spencer slowly lowered himself to his knees amidst the broken glass. His hands were shaking violently as he reached out and touched the dark leather cover. He flipped the heavy cover open. He bypassed the hundreds of pages of dense, suffocating legal jargon, his sweaty fingers fumbling wildly as he turned to the very last section of the massive file. The ultimate signature page. The specific page that legally bound his fraudulent loan to the shadow bank and permanently sealed his fate. He stared at the page. His eyes frantically scanned the black ink. Suddenly, his breathing stopped completely. His entire body went incredibly rigid. The remaining color drained from his face so fast he looked as though he might pass out right there on the ruined dining room floor. His eyes widened to an impossible degree, locked onto a single printed line at the bottom of the page. Jasmine watched him carefully from the doorway, her arms crossed, recognizing the exact moment a man realizes his life is entirely over. "Read it." "Spencer," I demanded. "Read the name of the sole owner and managing partner of Aegis Capital Lending." Spencer opened his mouth, but no sound came out. He looked up at me, his eyes filled with absolute, unadulterated horror. He looked back down at the paper, his mind desperately trying to reject the words printed in bold black ink. "Read it out loud," I said, taking one step closer, towering over his kneeling form. Spencer swallowed hard, clutching the paper tightly. His voice was barely a whisper when he finally forced the words out into the open air. "Managing partner and chief executive officer of Aegis Capital Lending." He paused immediately after reading the title, his vocal cords seizing up in pure panic. He squeezed his eyes shut, shaking his head rapidly as if trying to physically dislodge the reality of the black ink printed on the page. "Read the name aloud." "Spencer?" I repeated, my tone completely devoid of any mercy or familial warmth. "Madeline." He choked out, his voice cracking violently in the middle of the word. "Madeline Vance." The thick leather binder slipped from his trembling hands and crashed onto the hardwood floor, sending another spray of fine porcelain dust into the heavy air. He slumped backward onto his heels, completely defeated by the sheer magnitude of his own catastrophic failure. Beatrice froze in place. Her hands, still dripping with spilled wine and brown gravy, hovered uselessly in the air. She looked frantically from the fallen binder on the floor to my face, her mind violently rejecting the information she had just heard. "What did he just say?" she demanded, her voice shrill, defensive, and trembling with fear. "Madeline, what kind of sick forgery is this? You do not own a private equity bank. You are just a corporate accountant. You do not have $3 million to lend to anyone in the corporate sector." I turned my cold gaze to my mother, watching her perfect suburban world completely shatter before my eyes. "You never actually asked what I do at Vanguard Capital, Beatrice. You just assumed I pushed papers in a cubicle because it fit your narrative perfectly. I am a senior forensic accountant, yes, but I am also a managing equity partner. I track hidden corporate assets and I personally manage high-yield distressed debt portfolios. 3 years ago, I established Aegis Capital Lending as a highly specialized private equity subsidiary." I looked back down at Spencer, who was staring at the ruined floor with hollow, lifeless eyes. "When your ridiculous tech startup began hemorrhaging massive amounts of cash 6 months ago, I knew you would exhaust your traditional credit lines very quickly. I knew you would panic and look for unregulated shadow loans to maintain your pathetic facade of success. So I made absolutely sure my firm was the very first one your shady loan brokers contacted. I personally underwrote the $3 million you so desperately needed to keep playing CEO." Beatrice let out a strangled, desperate gasp, stumbling backward until she hit the edge of the mahogany dining table. "You gave him the money," she whispered, her eyes suddenly wide with a mixture of terror and sudden delusional hope. "Then you can just forgive the loan, Madeline. If it is your company, you can just cancel the debt right now. We do not have to lose the family house to the bank." I let out a harsh, unforgiving laugh that echoed through the room. "Cancel the debt. Mother, you still do not understand a single thing about how the real business world operates. I did not give him that vast sum of money to save his company. I gave him that money to trap him." I took a deliberate step closer to where Beatrice was leaning weakly against the dining table. I gave him enough rope to hang himself. I knew he did not have the liquid assets to secure a private loan of that magnitude. I knew he would be forced to leverage this massive estate. And I knew beyond a shadow of a doubt that he would forge your signature to get his hands on the cash. He is exactly the greedy, entitled monster you raised him to be. I just provided the legal paperwork." Spencer covered his pale face with his shaking hands, letting out a pathetic, muffled sob that echoed loudly. He finally understood the absolute, inescapable scope of his crushing defeat. He had spent his entire life thinking he was the smartest person in the room, constantly looking down on me, treating me exactly like the family servant. All the while, I was holding the invisible strings, patiently waiting for the perfect moment to finally pull them tight and watch him fall. I looked around the ruined dining room. I looked at the shattered, crystal-stained wallpaper and broken chairs scattered everywhere. This house was a monument to Beatrice's vanity and Spencer's arrogance. It was the physical manifestation of my childhood. Now I owned it. Legally, completely, and permanently. The grand dining room went dead silent, leaving only the sound of my brother weeping on the floor. I looked down at him and smiled. "You didn't borrow money from a faceless bank, Spencer. You borrowed it from me." Spencer stopped weeping. The sheer shock of my statement acted like ice water thrown directly into his face. He stared up at me from his position on the ruined floor, his breath hitching in his throat. Beatrice stood completely paralyzed beside the dining table, her mind struggling to process the monumental shift in power. For my entire life, she had controlled the narrative. She had held the purse strings and the family home over my head as tools of manipulation. Now she was looking at the woman who held the deed to her entire existence. "You did not borrow money from a faceless institution," I repeated, ensuring every single syllable landed with maximum impact. "You borrowed it from Aegis Capital. You borrowed it from my firm." I took a slow step around the shattered porcelain, positioning myself so I could look down at both my brother and my mother. "It really was not difficult to track your downward spiral, Spencer. You left a digital trail of desperation across the entire financial sector. When traditional banks rejected your requests for credit extensions 6 months ago, you started shopping your garbage financials to the private equity markets in New York. You were completely frantic. You needed cash to maintain your bloated payroll and your ridiculous leased sports cars. My risk assessment team at Vanguard monitors distressed debt applications across multiple high-yield lending platforms. I explained smoothly, watching his eyes widen with terror as I laid out the mechanics of his downfall. Your file was flagged by an automated system and brought to my desk. Any other underwriter would have taken one look at your fabricated revenue projections and thrown your application directly into the shredder. You had no real product, no user base, and no viable strategy. You were a walking liability. Beatrice gasped, clutching the edge of the table. You knew he was failing, she whispered, her voice laced with venom. You knew he was in trouble and you did not warn us. Warn you? I laughed softly. Mother, he is a 35-year-old man pretending to be a tech visionary. It is not my job to save him from his own incompetence. Instead of denying the application, I took personal control of his file. I became his underwriter. I knew he needed a massive injection of capital quickly, and I knew he did not have the liquid assets to secure it. The only thing of value he had access to was this estate. I looked directly into Spencer's hollow eyes. I knew you would try to leverage the house. I also knew Beatrice would never willingly sign away her most prized possession. She loves this house more than she loves either of us. That meant you had only one option left to get the money. You had to forge the documents. You set me up. Spencer breathed out, his voice shaking with a mixture of awe and absolute horror. I expedited the approval process. I continued ignoring his weak accusation. Standard underwriting for a $3 million shadow mortgage takes weeks of rigorous background checks. I waived them all. I pushed the paperwork through in 3 days. I made it incredibly easy for you to commit federal fraud. I gave you the loaded gun, Spencer, but you were the one who enthusiastically pulled the trigger. You forged our mother's signature, you had it illegally notarized, and you wired the cash into your offshore accounts. You gave him the money knowing he would default. Beatrice cried out, her voice rising in a fresh wave of panic. You predatory monster! You wanted him to fail so you could steal the house from me. I did not steal anything. I corrected sharply. I executed a legally binding financial contract under strict corporate law, a contract your beloved son initiated entirely on his own free will. I gave him a $3 million loan. He spent all the money. He missed 3 consecutive monthly payments. The terms of the loan clearly state that upon 90 days of default, the lender assumes full and immediate ownership of the collateral. The pieces finally clicked together in Spencer's terrified mind. The dense fog of his narcissistic panic lifted, revealing the stark, undeniable reality of his situation. He looked at the thick, red-tagged binder lying on the floor, then slowly looked back up at me. His hands began to shake violently again, as the ultimate truth crushed the last breath out of his lungs. By forging Beatrice's signature on that real estate deed and actively securing the massive shadow loan through my private equity firm, he had not just ruined his own miserable life. He had not just committed a severe federal crime. He had legally surrendered the entire estate directly to his sister. Spencer remained on his knees, surrounded by the shattered remnants of my mother's fine porcelain. His chest heaved violently as his panic finally crystallized into a desperate, frantic need for survival. He stared at the red-tagged binder resting by his feet. He could not accept that he had lost. His narcissistic ego simply could not process a reality where I had completely outmaneuvered him. He scrambled for a loophole, a legal lifeline, to pull himself out of the deep grave he had just dug. You cannot enforce that contract, Madeline, Spencer stammered, his voice raw and raspy. He pointed a shaking finger at the thick leather binder. It is entirely void. You just admitted out loud that you knew I forged Mom's signature on the deed and the loan application. A contract based on a forged signature is legally null and void in the state of Connecticut. You cannot foreclose on a house using fraudulent paperwork. He looked up at Jasmine, his eyes wide and pleading for validation. She knows it is a fake signature, Jasmine. Tell her she cannot legally seize the house. The law protects the rightful owner. Mom still owns the estate. Jasmine did not flinch. She leaned slightly against the doorframe, her arms crossed over her tailored suit, watching his pathetic display with absolute coldness. I am a venture capitalist, Spencer, she replied flatly. I am not your defense attorney, but I strongly suggest you listen very carefully to what your sister is about to say. I took a slow, deliberate step closer to him, my heels crunching softly on the broken glass. I looked down at the golden child who had spent his entire life believing the rules did not apply to him. You are absolutely right, Spencer, I said, my voice completely calm and devoid of any emotion. A forged contract is legally voidable. If Beatrice officially contests the signature on the deed and files a formal affidavit stating that she did not authorize the $3 million loan, Aegis Capital cannot legally execute the foreclosure tomorrow morning. The estate would remain in her name. Spencer let out a massive, ragged sigh of relief. A sudden, ugly grin spread across his pale face. He pushed himself slightly off the floor, his confidence instantly reigniting. I knew it, he sneered, looking back up at me with a triumphant glare. You thought you were so clever, Maddie, but you overplayed your hand. You cannot take the house. Mom will file the affidavit tomorrow morning. The loan is void. I let his brief moment of arrogant victory linger in the heavy air of the dining room before I crushed it completely. Yes, she can file the affidavit. I continued smoothly, matching his gaze with an icy stare. But if Beatrice officially declares the loan documents fraudulent, Aegis Capital is legally mandated to report the $3 million theft to the Federal Bureau of Investigation immediately. The moment she signs that affidavit to save her house, she signs the criminal complaint that sends you to federal prison for a minimum of 15 years for wire fraud, bank fraud, and aggravated identity theft. Spencer's triumphant grin vanished instantly. The color drained from his face for the final time. On the other hand, I said softly, leaning down slightly, so he could hear every single syllable. If Beatrice chooses to protect her golden child from a decade in a federal penitentiary, she must legally acknowledge the signature on the deed as her own. She must honor the contract. And if she honors the contract, the foreclosure proceeds exactly as planned tomorrow morning at 9 o'clock. Aegis Capital takes full ownership of the estate, and you are both evicted immediately. I stood back up, surveying the absolute devastation I had orchestrated. So, Spencer, those are your only two options. You can void the contract and go to federal prison for 15 years. Or you can honor the contract and I own your entire world. It is checkmate. The silence that followed was suffocating. There was no escape. No buzzwords, no charm, no manipulation could alter the brutal legal reality of his situation. I had backed him into a corner with absolutely no exit. Beatrice stood frozen by the ruined dining table. She had heard every word. The choice was violently laid out before her. She could save her precious suburban mansion, her social status, and her wealthy lifestyle, but it would require sending her beloved perfect son directly to a maximum security prison. Or she could save her son, but she would have to willingly surrender everything she owned and become entirely homeless by tomorrow morning. She looked at Spencer kneeling in the dirt and broken glass. She looked at the man who had stolen millions, ruined their lives, and blamed her for it. The grand matriarch finally snapped. Beatrice lunged forward with terrifying speed. She did not scream. She did not cry. She simply reached back and delivered a vicious, full-handed slap directly across Spencer's face. The sharp crack echoed like a gunshot through the silent house. Spencer fell sideways from the force of the blow, his hand flying up to cover his rapidly reddening cheek. He stared up at his mother in absolute shock, his mouth opening and closing like a suffocating fish. For 35 years, Beatrice had shielded him from every single consequence of his actions. She had defended his worst behavior, financed his delusions, and prioritized his comfort over my basic needs. Now faced with the loss of her own luxury, She turned on him with the viciousness of a cornered animal. It was a spectacular, horrifying display of self-preservation. Beatrice did not look at Spencer after she struck him. She completely erased him from her line of sight, as if he had suddenly ceased to exist. She spun around to face me, her posture rapidly shifting from an enraged attacker to a pleading, desperate victim. The harsh lines of fury on her face melted into an artificial expression of deep maternal affection that made my stomach physically churn. She reached out her hands clasped together in front of her chest, taking a tentative step toward me over the ruined china. Madeline. My beautiful girl. Beatrice murmured, her voice dripping with a sickly sweet desperation. You were right all along. I see it now. I have been entirely blind to his true nature. He is a criminal. He is a liar who took advantage of my generous heart and my trusting nature. He stole from me just like he tried to steal from you. We are both victims of his terrible greed. She took another step closer, her eyes wide and pleading. I will pack his bags right now, Madeline. I will throw him out into the street tonight. He will never set foot in this house again. You and I can fix this. You are the rightful owner of the estate now, and I could not be prouder of your incredible success. You are so brilliant. You just need to let your mother stay here. We can be a real family, just the two of us. I will make this your home forever. I stared at the woman who had birthed me, feeling a wave of absolute freezing disgust wash over my entire body. Her loyalty was completely transactional. She possessed no unconditional love for anyone, not even the golden child she had worshipped for 3 decades. The moment his value dropped to zero, she discarded him without a single second of hesitation. I took a step back, refusing to let her come any closer. Do not insult my intelligence, Beatrice, said my voice sharp and cutting. You are not a victim. You enabled every single terrible trait he possesses. You funded his arrogance with my future. You fed his narcissism because his supposed success made you look good at the country club. And 10 minutes ago, you were perfectly happy to disinherit me and leave me with nothing just to protect his fraudulent empire. Beatrice shook her head frantically, her artificial smile trembling. No, you do not understand. I was trying to protect the family name. I had to believe in him because he was my son. But you are my daughter, and you are the one who actually succeeded. You were trying to protect yourself, I interrupted loudly, shutting her down completely. And you still are. You do not love me, Mother. You just love the fact that my name is on the deed to this house. You would throw your own son to the wolves to keep your heated swimming pool and your prestigious zip code. But your pathetic offer is denied. I do not want to live in this house with you. I do not want a relationship with a parasite who changes loyalties based on the highest bidder. You are both being evicted tomorrow morning without exception. Beatrice let out a high-pitched shriek, stomping her foot on the floor like a petulant toddler. You cannot do this to me. I am your mother. You owe me respect. You owe me a roof over my head. I gave you life. Before I could deliver another dose of reality to her delusional rant, a calm, measured voice cut through the chaos of the dining room. Actually, Mrs. Vance, she owes you absolutely nothing. We all turned toward the doorway. Jasmine, who had remained a silent, calculating observer throughout the entire implosion of my family, finally stepped fully into the room. She bypassed the broken chairs and the spilled food, her posture radiating an effortless, terrifying authority. She did not look at Beatrice, and she barely glanced at Spencer, who was still cowering on the floor, clutching his face. Instead, Jasmine stepped forward, holding up her designer handbag. A small green light blinked steadily on the side. Jasmine held the bag at chest height, the tiny LED light pulsing like a heartbeat in the absolute stillness of the dining room. Every eye in the room was fixed on that small, unassuming beacon. Beatrice stopped her frantic bargaining, her mouth hanging open. Spencer, still clutching his stinging cheek on the floor, stared at the bag with a growing sense of dread that completely eclipsed the pain of his mother's slap. This is a custom-built security recorder, Jasmine said, her voice smooth and devoid of any theatrical emotion. Standard issue for top executives at my firm when conducting high-level negotiations. It is designed to capture crystal clear audio within a 50-foot radius, automatically uploading encrypted files to a secure offshore cloud server every 60 seconds. I activated it the exact second you picked up that first stack of porcelain plates and decided to act like a violent toddler. Spencer scrambled backward until his shoulders hit the wall. His breathing became erratic, his chest heaving as the implications of her words crashed over him. "You recorded me," he whispered, his voice cracking. "You cannot do that. This is a private residence." Jasmine tilted her head slightly, a cold smile touching the corners of her lips. "You invited me here for a corporate pitch, Spencer. That makes this a business meeting. And in the state of Connecticut, only one party needs to consent to a recording." I consented. She took a step further into the room, her high heels avoiding the shattered glass with practiced elegance. "I have spent the last 15 minutes listening to the most pathetic display of incompetence and criminal liability I have ever encountered in my entire career." Jasmine continued, her gaze locking onto my brother. "I have a flawless high-definition audio file of you explicitly admitting to forging real estate deeds. I have you confessing to defrauding a private equity firm. I have you threatening physical violence against Madeline, and I have you berating the mother who funded your delusions. Every single desperate, incriminating word you have spoken tonight is currently sitting safely on my corporate servers." Beatrice let out a low moan, bringing both hands up to cover her face. The realization that her family's darkest, most humiliating secrets were now securely in the hands of a Wall Street billionaire was too much for her fragile ego to bear. She realized that even if she was willing to lie for Spencer, even if she was willing to sacrifice the estate to save him from prison, it no longer mattered. The choice had been entirely stripped from her hands. Jasmine held the ultimate trump card. Jasmine reached into the bag with her free hand and retrieved her smartphone. She held it up, the screen illuminating her flawless features in the dim light of the ruined room. The screen displayed an active audio file, fully processed and ready to be distributed. "You thought you could leverage my firm's reputation to save your sinking ship?" Jasmine said, her tone dropping to a dangerous whisper. "You thought you could use me as a prop in your fake billionaire lifestyle. But I do not tolerate liars, Spencer. And I certainly do not tolerate mediocre men who commit federal fraud and then cry on the floor when a woman outsmarts them." Spencer raised his hands in a pathetic gesture of surrender. "Jasmine, please wait," he begged, tears streaming down his face. "You do not have to do this. You canceled the merger. You protected your firm. Vanguard is safe. You can just delete the file. Walk away. Let us handle this internally as a family. I will disappear. I will never contact you again. Just please do not send that audio. It will destroy my entire life." "Your life was destroyed the moment you forged that signature," Jasmine replied coldly. She looked down at her phone screen. Her thumb hovered deliberately over the send button. "As a fiduciary of Vanguard Capital, I have a strict legal and ethical obligation to report major financial crimes. If I cover this up, I become an accessory to your $3 million fraud. I am not risking my license, my firm, or my reputation to protect a pathetic con artist." Jasmine did not hesitate for another single second. She pressed the screen with a firm tap. The decision was finally made forever. A soft electronic swoosh echoed through the dining room, signaling the successful transmission of the message. Jasmine slid the phone back into her pocket, looking at Spencer with absolute finality. "The audio file is now with Vanguard's senior legal counsel. I have explicitly instructed them to forward the entire unedited recording to the Securities and Exchange Commission and the Federal Bureau of Investigation at exactly 8 o'clock tomorrow morning." The finality of the sent message struck Spencer with the physical force of a massive freight train. The grand illusion of his entire life, the carefully curated image of a brilliant tech founder, completely dissolved into the spilled wine and broken china. He let out a hollow, agonizing gasp, his knees buckling entirely beneath him. He crashed onto the ruined hardwood floor, no longer caring about the sharp crystal shards tearing into the fabric of his expensive designer trousers. He scrambled forward frantically on his hands and knees, completely abandoning any remaining shred of his pride and dignity. He crawled toward Jasmine like a desperate, starving animal, reaching out with trembling, blood-stained hands to grab the hem of her tailored suit jacket. "Jasmine, please, you cannot do this to us," he sobbed loudly, his voice completely raw and overwhelmingly pathetic. "I made a terrible mistake. I admit it right now. I was under so much immense pressure to perform, to be the absolute genius everyone always expected me to be. But the business does not matter anymore. The merger does not matter at all. The only thing that truly matters in this entire world is us." He looked up at her, tears streaming freely down his pale face, his chest heaving with exaggerated theatrical sorrow. He was deploying his final, most desperate weapon. He was trying to weaponize romantic vulnerability against a powerful woman whose exact job was to analyze behavioral risk. "I love you, Jasmine," he pleaded, his voice breaking into a high-pitched, desperate whine. "I love you so incredibly much. I only wanted to build a massive financial empire so I could be truly worthy of a successful woman like you. I wanted to give you the absolute world. We can run away from all of this disaster. We can move to California today, start completely fresh, and just be together forever. You are the only good thing in my miserable, complicated life. Please do not send me to a federal prison. Please do not abandon me when I need you the absolute most. I love you. I swear I will do anything you want me to do. Just give me one more single chance to prove the incredible man I can truly be for you." Jasmine did not pull her suit jacket away from his frantic grip. She simply looked down at his trembling, pathetic form with an expression of absolute, unadulterated disgust. Her dark eyes were as cold and unforgiving as a frozen winter lake. She listened to his desperate, pathetic declarations of fake love, without a single flicker of human emotion registering on her flawless face. When his pathetic, hysterical sobbing finally subsided into ragged, shallow gasps, she spoke. Her voice was incredibly quiet, but it carried the lethal, inescapable weight of a judge delivering a final death sentence. "You do not love me, Spencer," she said smoothly, her sharp words slicing effortlessly through the heavy, suffocating tension of the ruined dining room. "You do not even possess the basic psychological capacity to genuinely love another human being. You are a completely hollow, narcissistic parasite. You never loved me for a single second. You only loved the $20 million term sheets I kept inside my corporate briefcase. You loved the social prestige of standing next to a highly successful woman because you knew deep down in your core that you were nothing but a complete financial fraud." Jasmine reached down slowly and firmly, pried his trembling, bleeding fingers off the pristine hem of her charcoal jacket. She let his hand drop heavily onto the wet, ruined floor. "You wanted to give me the world," she mocked softly, a bitter, humorless smile crossing her lips. "Spencer, you do not even own the cheap shoes currently on your feet. You are a confessed criminal actively facing a decade in a maximum security federal penitentiary, and my firm does not associate with convicted criminals. Goodbye, Spencer." Without another single word, Jasmine stepped effortlessly over his pathetic, weeping body. She walked out of the ruined dining room, her expensive heels clicking steadily against the hardwood floor, never once looking back at the wreckage she left behind. Spencer collapsed onto his stomach, burying his face deep in his arms, his hysterical sobbing echoing endlessly off the vaulted ceilings. I watched my older brother break into a million irreparable pieces. I did not feel a single drop of sympathy or regret. I walked slowly toward where he lay in the dirt and the broken glass. I stepped squarely over his trembling body, my leather shoes passing directly over his head without hesitation. As I stood above him, I reached a steady hand deep into the pocket of my designer coat and pulled out a single perfectly folded legal document. I unfolded the crisp white paper with deliberate slowness. The sharp creases of the document stood out in stark contrast to the absolute filth and destruction surrounding us. Spencer continued to weep softly on the floor, a broken, pathetic rhythm that served as the perfect background noise for the final act of this family tragedy. I bypassed his trembling form entirely and walked directly toward my mother. Beatrice was still leaning heavily against the mahogany dining table. Her eyes tracked my movement, locking onto the piece of paper in my hand. For a fleeting, delusional second, a spark of hope ignited in her bloodshot eyes. In her deeply fractured mind, she actually believed I had pulled out a reprieve. She thought it was a waiver, a cancelled contract, or a new trust agreement that would somehow magically restore her grand suburban kingdom. She reached out with a trembling wine-stained hand, her fingers eager to grasp her salvation. I placed the document squarely into her palm. She snatched it up and brought it close to her face, her eyes frantically scanning the bold black text at the top of the page. The spark of hope extinguished the absolute second she read the title. Her jaw dropped open. A fresh wave of sheer terror washed away the artificial affection she had tried to project just moments earlier. "This is a formal 30-day notice to vacate the premises," I stated, my voice echoing with the cold, undeniable authority of a property owner addressing a troublesome tenant. "I drafted it yesterday afternoon. As the sole proprietor of Aegis Capital Lending, I am exercising my legal right to take immediate possession of this estate due to severe contractual default. You have exactly 1 month to pack your designer clothes, gather whatever cheap trinkets you can carry, and vacate my property. If you are still inside this house at 9 o'clock in the morning on the 31st day, I will have the local sheriff physically remove you for criminal trespassing." Beatrice crushed the eviction notice in her fist. Her entire body shook with a violent, uncontrollable rage mixed with absolute despair. She could not comprehend the total loss of her power. She had spent decades ruling this household with an iron fist, using her wealth to demand unquestioning loyalty. Now she was nothing more than a squatter facing imminent removal. "You cannot do this to your own mother!" Beatrice shrieked, the sound tearing violently from her throat. Her voice was shrill and desperate, lacking any of her usual country club refinement. "We are family, Madeline. You share my flesh. You share my blood. Blood is thicker than water. You cannot throw your own flesh and blood out onto the street like common trash. It is unnatural. God will punish you for this level of cruelty." I stared at her frantic, tear-stained face. The sheer hypocrisy of her statement was almost suffocating. She was invoking the sacred bond of family only after she had completely destroyed it. "Blood is thicker than water," I repeated softly, tasting the bitter irony of the words. "That is a very convenient proverb for you to remember right now, Mother. But you did not care about my blood when I was 18 years old. You did not care about family loyalty when I sat at the kitchen table with my university acceptance letters crying because I could not afford the tuition." I took a step closer, forcing her to look directly into my eyes. "Do you remember that exact day, Beatrice? Do you remember looking me dead in the eye and telling me that my education was a terrible investment? You took $60,000. You drained every single penny of my college fund, the money my father specifically set aside for my future, and you handed it to Spencer so he could lease a luxury office space for a startup that failed in 8 months. You stole my future to fund his ego. You forced me to take out massive student loans and work 3 jobs just to survive, while you bought him a brand new sports car to celebrate his completely fake success." Beatrice opened her mouth to defend herself, to spin another lie, but I cut her off instantly. "You did not treat that money as a gift." I continued, my voice cold and relentless. "You treated it as an executive decision, a corporate reallocation of family resources. Well, Mother, I am simply adopting your aggressive investment strategy. I am reallocating my assets. I paid off my student loans, I built my own firm from the ground up, and I bought your massive fraudulent debt. Consider this $2 million house the accumulated interest on that forced loan you took from me 10 years ago." Beatrice let out a devastated wail, dropping the crumpled eviction notice onto the wet floor. She buried her face in her hands, sobbing uncontrollably. The grand matriarch was finally broken, crushed under the absolute weight of her own terrible choices. I did not offer her a shoulder to cry on. I did not offer her a single word of comfort. I turned my back on her weeping form and walked over to the hallway closet. I reached inside and pulled out my heavy wool coat. I slipped my arms into the sleeves, adjusting the collar with meticulous care. I picked up my designer leather briefcase, feeling the satisfying weight of the red-tagged binder resting safely inside. I walked past the ruined dining room one last time. Spencer was still on the floor, curled into a pathetic ball. Beatrice was weeping over the shattered remains of her precious porcelain plates. They were entirely trapped in the prison they had built for themselves. I reached the heavy oak front door and turned the brass handle. The cool, crisp night air rushed in, sweeping away the suffocating smell of spilled wine and desperate panic. I stepped out onto the front porch, the heavy door clicking shut behind me with absolute finality. I walked down the long, paved driveway toward my waiting car, leaving my biological family behind forever, without shedding a single tear. The crisp autumn night air hit my face the moment I stepped off the porch, immediately clearing the suffocating stench of spilled wine and desperate panic from my lungs. The heavy oak front door clicked shut behind me, severing my ties to that toxic household with a satisfying sense of absolute finality. I pulled my wool coat a little tighter against the chill, the dry fallen leaves crunching sharply under my leather shoes, as I walked down the long manicured driveway. The expansive suburban neighborhood was entirely silent, a pristine bubble of fake perfection that starkly contrasted with the total financial and emotional ruin I had just orchestrated inside. I did not walk toward my own modest sedan parked down the street. Instead, my eyes locked onto the sleek midnight black Porsche Panamera idling quietly at the edge of the curb. The headlights cut sharply through the darkness, illuminating the swirling autumn mist. Jasmine was standing casually, leaning against the driver's side door. She had her arms crossed over her tailored charcoal suit jacket, looking entirely unfazed by the spectacular psychological demolition we had just witnessed. I approached the luxury vehicle, the satisfying weight of my designer briefcase anchoring my stride. Jasmine did not offer a polite, meaningless smile. She did not offer empty platitudes about family trauma or pretend to be shocked by the sheer depravity of my mother and brother. We were both apex predators in the financial sector, and we understood exactly what had just transpired. As I stopped a few feet away from her, we shared a long, silent look of profound mutual respect. It was the kind of recognition that only exists between women who have had to claw their way to the absolute top of a male-dominated industry, women who had been constantly underestimated and forced to be 10 times smarter and 100 times more ruthless than the men standing in their way. She looked at me, not as the pathetic little sister of a failed tech founder, but as the managing partner of Aegis Capital Lending. I had successfully weaponized a multi-million-dollar shadow mortgage right under her nose, using her scheduled term sheet meeting as the ultimate catalyst for my brother's destruction. And she absolutely respected the play. That was the most ruthlessly efficient hostile takeover I have ever had the pleasure of witnessing, Jasmine said, her voice cutting cleanly through the crisp night air. She uncrossed her arms and pulled her car keys from her pocket. The Porsche beeped softly as the doors unlocked. You completely dismantled a fraudulent tech company, acquired a $2 million piece of prime real estate, and orchestrated a federal criminal investigation before the main course was even served. I am genuinely impressed, Madeline, and Vanguard Capital does not use that word lightly. I allowed a genuine relaxed smile to cross my face for the very first time all evening. I appreciate the compliment, Jasmine. It took months of very careful financial structuring, but the execution was flawless. Jasmine opened the driver's side door, resting her hand lightly on the sleek roof of the car. Cancel your car service, she offered smoothly. I am heading back into Manhattan tonight. Get in. My firm has a massive surplus of liquid capital looking for aggressive deployment, and Aegis clearly possesses the kind of high-yield distressed debt portfolios we are looking to acquire. I think we should merge our resources. We can discuss the preliminary financial architecture of a Vanguard and Aegis partnership over a $500 bottle of Bordeaux I have waiting in my penthouse. I looked back at the Grand Colonial House one last time. The large bay windows of the dining room were glowing warmly in the darkness, a beautiful exterior hiding the absolute carnage inside. Even from the end of the driveway, the muffled, violent sounds of Beatrice and Spencer screaming at each other bled through the expensive glass. The golden boy and his enabling mother were finally tearing each other apart, completely trapped in the suffocating reality of their impending homelessness and federal indictments. Their toxic dynamic was no longer my problem. I turned back to Jasmine, my smile widening. "That sounds like an incredibly lucrative conversation," I replied. I walked around the sleek hood of the Panamera and slid into the luxurious leather passenger seat. The heavy car door shut, instantly silencing the muffled screams coming from the house. The interior of the Porsche was a sanctuary of quiet, expensive perfection. Jasmine slid behind the wheel, shifted the car into gear, and pressed the accelerator. The powerful engine roared to life, smooth and responsive. As the luxury car pulled away from the curb, rapidly leaving the pristine suburban neighborhood behind, I looked up into the side rearview mirror. I watched the house shrink into the darkness until it disappeared completely. I was finally free. I was incredibly wealthy. And as we sped toward the glowing skyline of the city, I knew I was moving toward a massive empire I had built entirely on my own.